From the CUBE studios in Palo Alto and Boston, bringing you data-driven insights from the CUBE and ETR. This is Breaking Analysis with Dave Vellante.
Agentic AI is being misread as a series of separate battles. For example, Snowflake versus Databricks, co-pilots versus agents, model makers versus app vendors, etc. We think the real story is that the biggest opportunity in software is converging around who owns the new intelligent client and the AI backend that makes it useful. The new client, you should think of that as the agent-based system of engagement. Snowflake's CoWork and Coco, for example, or Databricks Genie. Think Microsoft Copilot. Google's got Gemini Enterprise. ChatGPT, of course, has Codex, and of course, Claude CoWork with its momentum. And there, of course, there are others. But that client, we don't think can deliver the business outcomes that people want without a new back end, what we call a system of intelligence. Now that represents a model of the enterprise in terms of its business rules and, very importantly, that tacit knowledge, that tribal knowledge that people always talk about. We don't think you can build one without the other. Now, we frame this premise for this breaking analysis using Clay Christensen's integrated innovation concept and Jensen's extreme co-design, and we apply it to enterprise software. That is why Snowflake is the focal point for this breaking analysis, but not the whole story. Snowflake is not just competing with Databricks anymore. It's now in the same strategic arena as Microsoft, Google, OpenAI, Anthropic, Salesforce, SAP, ServiceNow. We'll put Celonis in there, and of course there are others. They're all trying to define where business users, builders, and agents get work done, and where the enterprise context that powers that work gets built. Now, the key premise again here is that the system of intelligence, that backend, does not only ingest data from pipelines and catalogs, etc. It does that, but it also learns from business users and builders through the agentic client. Here we're talking about skills, artifacts. You hear about semantic views. Query history is an important input. The actions that agents take, and of course the human reasoning traces, they all become inputs that provide direct feedback into the intelligence layer. So we think a key success factor is having the tightest feedback loop between the agentic client and the enterprise intelligence backend, and that requires deliberate software engineering that tightly couples the pieces of the stack. And once again, George Gilbert and I dig into the emerging AI software stack, and we'll connect the dots from what we learned at Snowflake Summit and, of course, Microsoft Build, which was last week, also in San Francisco, and we'll set up the Databricks Data and AI Summit that's coming in mid-June. George, once again, welcome. Thank you for your time.
Good to be with you, Dave.
All right, let's get into it. Alex, bring up the first slide. George, you came up with this concept in previous episodes, and we shared this, that there are more agents than fleas on a camel. But you're calling out Brett Taylor on this slide, he's a chairman of OpenAI. He's also the CEO of Sierra. And you put a but on this slide. What's the but?
Well, it's that there's this theme that came out of Y Combinator that vertical agents are going to be 10 times bigger than vertical SaaS. And, this is the services software story that all the work that, or much of the work that humans can do can be captured in agents. And if we can just bottle that knowledge up, we can turn these specialized agent companies into giant companies. And that's where I'm like, to make the point, there are more of these than there are fleas on the average camel. The problem, this is the but, is we're just building more silos, the same silos in it with a new technology that we've been building for 60 years. And the point of agents and what agents are driving for the new data infrastructure is that we have end-to-end infrastructure and visibility across how the enterprise works, so that you can achieve business outcomes, that they're not specialized silos, that you can like onboard a customer, you can a bank can do a know your customer process. And in a broader scope, you can connect planning and operations so that you can realign the activity of an entire enterprise, all the way from long-term activities down to, let's say, if you're a logistics company, it might be, where are we going to build new fulfillment centers, to down to what am I going to pick, pack, and ship, and how for this order. All those things need to be aligned. To do that alignment, you can't have silos. And that's why I object, and I think customers will find limiting all these siloed agents.
So you feel like, well, clearly Sierra is one of those fleas on the camel's back.
I picked them, yes, as an example, because they're just saying, we'll do your customer related, processes, starting with interacting on your website. And they have this, what appears to be, a very, very solid agent development toolkit. But the hard part is the intelligent backend that harmonizes your business processes and your data and your tacit knowledge. And that's not there. And that's what we're talking about, that what Snowflake's trying to build, what Databricks is trying to build, what Microsoft showed really coherently. Maybe it's not all there yet, with Build this week. And, and it also points out that OpenAI and Anthropic need to have an offering, whether they build it or partner for it or buy it, that their clients aren't going to be competitive unless they can be co-designed with a backend that has this end-to-end view of the business.
Yeah, great. And so Sierra probably gets acquired, most likely by OpenAI, and Brett Taylor, he's a player. He'll be around for a while. Okay, yeah. Thank you, George. As we think about the premise that we put forth in our open, let's bring it back to the emerging AI software stack. The field's starting to coalesce around this idea that the system of intelligence is forming as we predicted, quite some time ago, but maybe in ways that are more clear to us now. Alex, if you bring up the next slide, we can see the space is getting crowded here to review the framework that we've been using and sharing the last several weeks and months around the AI software stack. It comprises not only the modern data platforms of Snowflake and Databricks, but also the systems of record, Oracle, SAP, Salesforce, Workday, et cetera. And we've talked a lot about governance catalogs, not only Horizon and Polaris, Unity and others. You got Calibra, Informatica, et cetera. At the very top, we have that system of agency that, that takes the action. The action is orchestrated. But the emerging insight is the left side a system of engagement with co-pilots and harnesses and coding agents and that new user interface. And we're, of course, showing Snowflake CoWork, which was renamed this past week from Snowflake Intelligence, and then Databricks Genie. So, George, that's the setup, but take us through how these pieces fit together and the increasing importance of the system engagement as a feeder for the system of intelligence, the SOI, where we've added Microsoft Work IQ to Fabric IQ. The combination of that is sort of their platform that they put forth last week. And, of course, the LLMs that are there. Please, George.
Okay, so we've been talking about this stack really, like a couple of years ago, we started talking about the separation of the data platform from the data. And then about a year ago, we started talking about the system of intelligence as a layer on top. And then the system of engagement was how you interacted with this stack. And of course, all the excitement, as we alluded to in the last slide, is the agents on top. But again, I'll go back and say the most valuable piece of real estate for the next 10 years is the system of intelligence, because that's what binds everything. Now, what we did not get right in the past was that the system of engagement and the system of intelligence have to be co-designed. And as we're going to explain over the rest of this review, you in interacting with the system of engagement, you are specifying or programming some of the intelligence into the system of intelligence, and partly it is learning from the users, business users, and the builders. And then, in other words, if you don't have both the front end and the back end, you can't really build either properly. That I don't think we got, and that was highlighted fairly effectively by Snowflake this week.
All right, thank you. So Alex, bring up the next slide. And so what you're saying is the software stack, which was largely comprised of these independent puzzle pieces that fit together through whatever integration path was chosen, either the customer integrates or the ecosystem or other tooling, but they're now becoming much more interdependent and connected and purposefully integrated. Is that what you're basically positing?
Yes, and let's sort of separate out and walk through what each piece stands for. So 2 years ago, we talked about the 6 data platform, where the data platform, like a Snowflake, no longer owned the data. It was in an open format, and Databricks pioneered this, but the Delta format is still kind of, even though it's an open format, the industry's coalesced on Iceberg, which has really been led by Snowflake. So that brings up this interesting conclusion, which is, if the data platform doesn't own the data, then what is its, is it just an analytic engine? And so the value moved up into the governance metadata. And this is the Horizon catalog or Databricks Unity catalog. This is where you start to add meaning to the data, where you're capturing not just metrics and dimensions, but you're trying to capture like how the different entities in your business relate, how customers are related to orders, and orders to line items, and orders to, what's in inventory, that sort of thing. But those are just definitions. The system of intelligence is when those definitions become executable code, and not just executable code, but they are a live representation of the business. That's why the code and the state of the business merge. And when that happens, you can answer questions like, why did something happen? What's likely to happen? And what should we do? That's when you have this living representation of the business that lets you diagnose problems and prescribe actions, and where you have this end-to-end view of the business. Now, just to be clear, that this is the substrate for agents, and all the light and heat in the industry is on the system of agency, but it's driving more than anything else the build out of the system of intelligence. This what we call a 4D map, or a model of the state of the business, and what our new understanding is now is so much of this system of intelligence. It's not a bunch of knowledge engineers building a rich intergalactic model of the business. It's learned some partially bottom up from business users and builders, but there has to be a top-down component to make it all coherent. And that learning and specifying part comes from the system of engagement. That's why you need both the new intelligent client and this intelligent backend. And just to put one fine point on this, it's like when Windows emerged, and then the browser, and then the mobile client. Each of those needed a new backend to support it. So with Windows, it became client server. With a browser, it became web backends. And then with mobile, web and mobile clients eventually drove the creation of the cloud. And we need a new backend to complement this new client. That's what's going on.
Yeah, it's very clearly evolving. I mean, we saw pretty quickly that RAG-based chatbots, plugging an LLM into a database didn't really deliver that much value. We're seeing something similar play out with the orchestration of agents, which is getting a lot of attention, but the technology community knows that without that system of intelligence, those agents are not going to be able to effectively act in a trustworthy way. George, at Snowflake Summit this week, we saw the company rebrand Cortex Code into Coco, kind of cute, and Snowflake Intelligence, they rebranded into Snowflake CoWork. So a lot of people using the term CoWork. The former is aimed at developers Cocoa is aimed at developers, the latter at business users. So Alex, bring up the next slide, and George, walk us through why CoWork, the business user piece of the puzzle, supports our intelligence thesis.
Okay, so let me walk through some of what the capabilities of Snowflake CoWork for business users contains, but then let me broaden that out into why it is a window into something much more profound. So capabilities today, the deep research that we're familiar with, but deep research as we're familiar with it is mostly going out on the web and doing essentially multi-part queries and synthesis of web-based material. But now you can do that across your business data and the unstructured information associated with that business data. And the reason this is important is this is Snowflake's center of gravity. They own a lot of the business's analytic data. And so it becomes like a gravity well to tie unstructured information to that. Like it might have a lot of information about support and sales information. And then there might be a lot of documents or tacit knowledge associated with that. And this deep research allows you to search across that information and synthesize it. Now, there's things like artifacts, and we know from Claude and from OpenAI, artifacts are these generated visualizations. But here, these can be, in the context of Snowflake, they can be publishable dashboards that have governed views of live trusted data. Knowledge workers can explore the dashboards through conversation, not just clicks. And analysts can create and publish rich dashboards for others to interact with. So the idea is that teams can save, share, and collaborate on these artifacts that turn insights into reusable knowledge. This is another example of you need to own the client to capture all these interactions that enrich your understanding of the data. And also supported, if not now, then shortly, would be working with external tools like Excel. Now, again, the point here is you're partly specifying a dashboard that you want to work with, and the system is partly learning from things like user skills, and then you can share your skills in a catalog. And skills, we know, are these sort of natural language repeatable instructions to an intelligent backend. But think of what skills become. They become logic, and we'll talk about that. So this is, again, another example of part specifying, part learning. Now, I want to explain why this, even though it looked like a Snowflake catalog in part of in their CoWork, is part of something much richer and deeper and more profound. We're looking at a dashboard, but this could be a spreadsheet applet, a slide or design layout applet, and it's part of an editable canvas. I think the client where I've seen this that's most farthest along in building this is Hex and maybe Sigma, where you've got these rich visualization and interactive components as part of a broader container. Now, I want to tie this into why Wall Street is worried about Microsoft Office, because Microsoft also needs to own this canvas. We've talked about this before when we did the show on Nadella's choice or sacrifice, which is if you don't own this container, this canvas, you don't have as much control over the applets within it. And Office can become a coding agent sometime this year is going to sort of one-shot generate a little spreadsheet applet that might have Excel file format compatibility, even if it doesn't have all the functionality of Excel, the application itself. And they could generate a slide or design layout applet. And we already see this with Anthropic's MCP evolving to support user interfaces so that you could have richer backends. The point is, this is the new intelligent client. This is like the rise of Windows, like the rise of the browser. And if you control this, you have control over the boundaries of the components that go in it, and then the backend intelligence that supports it. That's why it's so important.
Got it. Excellent. All right. Now, last week for the audience, as you recall, we laid out the 5 layers of the system of intelligence. And with great detail, George, you specified the capabilities at each layer so that we could better understand the maturity model. Alex, if you bring up the next slide, let's walk through these pieces and map what we heard at Snowflake Summit into those 5 layers. The important point is we're bringing together the determinism of today's software, stack and software products that we know, and creating new capabilities with frontier models and other tooling to add in the non-deterministic capabilities that can reason, and altogether working toward this digital twin of the enterprise that George describes as the North Star. So George, take us through why that is so important and how Snowflake's capabilities map here.
Okay, so again, this is the system of intelligence. This is the intelligent backend. This is the ultimate prize, because this intelligence is what makes business users, builders, and agents effective at achieving business outcomes. For decades, the analytic DBMS was about ingesting, harmonizing, and activating summarized or aggregated transactional data and interaction data about what happened, where the interactions were captured in click streams. But now we're at a new layer where it's about ingesting, harmonizing, and activating the intelligence about why things happened, what's likely to happen, and what should happen. And this becomes a company's crown jewels. Remember, for decades, we said a company's data was a core corporate asset. Now we're saying the intelligence, which is the deterministic rules, the lower 2 layers in the chart here, and then the tacit knowledge, which is the upper 3 layers. These are the rules about how the business runs, and the tacit knowledge that's relevant when there are no rules or when the rules conflict. And that is the new crown jewels. And that intelligence comes partly from specifying, again, and partly by learning from the builders, business users, and agents. And that's why integrating the intelligent client is so critical, which is now what we're going to unpack. Oh, and I should, before we move on, let's just, Alex, if you can bring that back up, let me just call out some of the Snowflake elements. At the bottom layer, the Horizon catalog and the Polaris iceberg catalog, those are how you map to the underlying raw data. At the level above that, there's Horizon context and like semantic views. And in the future, the semantic views are what most people know of as BI metric and dimension definitions. The current semantic views from Snowflake are somewhat limited in scope, but when you get a view graph, as it'll emerge in the future, that's when you tie the metrics together so that it's something richer, like what AtScale has today, or Atlan, as we're going to see. Now, again, that's in the deterministic layer that will grow in the future, the layer 2, into a full ontology. That's when you represent all the business rules, not just the metrics and dimensions. Metrics give you measures. A full ontology tells you all the rules that used to be trapped in your operational applications. Now you can treat them as an asset. The next layer up, layer 3, this is where you start to capture the tacit knowledge. Cortex Sense enriches Horizon context with starting to connect some unstructured knowledge, the ambient knowledge, skills, artifacts, user memory. Again, tacit knowledge. In the future, and this they didn't talk about, but this is why they're buying Observe. You want expert reasoning, what the techies call evals. This is how good decisions are made. You capture that. So that's useful to guide both a user and an agent in making a decision in the future at level 4. When a user or an agent has to reason about something, they'll look at the context in the bottom 2 layers and the institutional memory in layer 3. And then this is not built out much in layer 5, but this is really important. Today, they have Cortex training. This is where you can fine-tune an agent. And they didn't talk about it that much in like the analyst breakout. But Microsoft's whole Build conference was about essentially fine-tuning your own agents on your data. And to fine-tune on your data, that's where you need this observability layer, which is coming from observe, because when the agents emit their reasoning traces, it's like clickstream. It's the new exhaust, only it's much more important. It becomes the system of truth for agent reasoning, and that's the foundation for continual learning. And it's the basis for observability, which is tell me what went wrong. Evals, which are help me build a better agent, or when I'm releasing a new version of an agent, help me make sure that it didn't regress, it gets better against the evals, and help me in real time when the agent's in operation to diagnose a problem and remediate it. That's the SRE. So all these layers are going to form this, what we call this system of intelligence. It's really, really the big prize.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, George, years ago, in a previous episode of Breaking Analysis, we predicted that Snowflake would absolutely have to evolve the Horizon catalog and sort of reconcile what's going on with Horizon and Polaris. And at the time, we were really focused on the gaps between Horizon and Polaris and the whole open source governance framework and, some of the battles in the marketplace. But of course, Polaris was spawned by Snowflake. And we discussed how much Horizon function it would allow into Polaris and how Snowflake would both, have to evolve that while protecting its monetization engine and its moat. And so, Alex, if you bring up the next slide, it speaks to the evolution of Horizon and the expanding capabilities, thereof. So, George, let's walk through how Horizon Context supports the system of intelligence and what we learned this week. Okay,
so Horizon Context, it pulls in metadata from, as you can see on the left side, databases, BI tools, ETL processes, and it enriches it with the business definitions like semantic views, which we talked about, lineage to provide a consistent logical source. It adds like a business glossary, which is a structured hierarchy of shared definitions. So you have consistent terminology, which is useful for business users who are querying in natural language. And in the future, this is where we were saying you go from metric views and a glossary. A full ontology is when you capture all the business process rules and relationships. That's when you get that digital twin of the enterprise. That's in the future. And we look to Snowflake to enlighten us how, a relational database can effectively support an ontology, because in the past that's been challenging for relational databases, but they could constrain the problem and make it effective. So we're really wondering how much they build. Do they need to partner, or do they constrain the problem? But the last point to make is in the enriched box here, that it's not just pulling it in, but it's learning from the interaction with the users. Like they can look at things like popularity, or other signals that, like which users use which data to disambiguate if there's conflict. In other words, this is the harmonization process where you don't want to top-down model everything, but you're pulling in essentially islands. But by having the users interact with it, you can look at popularity, or if there's ambiguity, you can propose a choice to the user about which is more important. This, again, is why you need that interaction with the client to harmonize all that semantic richness.
All right, excellent. Now, Alex, if you would again bring up the next slide, and we want to emphasize the relationship between the system of engagement and the system of intelligence, and specifically this notion of a closed loop, George, where user intentions and actions and interactions on the left side, they feed the SOI on the right side, which then, and then comes back and learns, and then provides intelligence back to the system of engagement. So this bi-directional manner, I probably should have had the arrows going both ways, but George, explain this in more detail, please.
Well, this does capture the idea that as users express their intent, say in the form of a query or a decision about activating some proposed action, that becomes like memory or skills or a signal to disambiguate the richness, the definitions that's in the system of intelligence. And as the system of intelligence learns, it enriches the system of engagement. And as we were saying, it might say, look, I have two different definitions for customer lifetime value, or, and here's the derivation for each one. Which should we use and how should we standardize? That interaction, we just wanted one slide to say, it's so much more effective building these things together. And that's why, even though we haven't seen it yet, we suspect OpenAI and Anthropic will need to somehow move into this business. But, this is building this backend is a very different business from building, a model and a harness and turning it into an agent. Similarly, it makes the point that competing for this system of engagement is a very different business from what Snowflake and Databricks have done in the past. That's why, each is moving into the other's turf.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Okay, so we want to show sort of how the back-end intelligence supports the system and gets value. So Alex, bring up the next slide. So here we're showing that back-end intelligence, how it's supporting the system and how it gets value from Coco, for example, which is the coding platform designed for developers, as we said, and CoWork, which is designed for the business users. George, this is where we sort of invoke, Clay Christensen's concepts and Jensen's extreme co-design. It's very relevant here with Horizon Context, accessing all these fragmented signals that you're showing here. And interestingly, you've crossed out the word automatically and replaced it with human in the loop. Why? Explain the importance and relevance of co-design and why you don't consider this to be automatic.
Okay, because this is, again, as you said, gets back to the co-design and why building the new backend requires an integrated client. So let me enumerate the functionality and how it needs to be supported by an intelligent client. This is how business users and builders interact with Horizon Context through CoWork and Coco, the old Snowflake code, so it can learn what can't be programmed. Learned part is it collects metadata from databases, BI tools, ETL processes, and it enriches it with business definitions like semantic views to provide a consistent logical source. The human in the loop right now, like the business glossary would be something offered by a domain expert, business user, or a builder for shared definitions, and that ensures consistent terminology. In the future, the ontology that we've talked about that incorporates business processes, rules, relationships, a richer model of how the business runs. We've been calling this the digital twin, but building ontologies is really, really challenging because for 30 years or more, we've talked about, and companies have tried building enterprise data models, and it never works when you do it top down. So I think what we're going to see more is like user skills where they're accomplishing individual workflows, and those workflows are learned as skills by the intelligent client. And then the system collects those skills in a catalog, and then it starts to harmonize them. And where it fails to harmonize, it might propose to a user, help me disambiguate this. Here's what I think, these are trying to accomplish. In other words, those skills become part of the ontology, part of this shared harmonized digital twin, where the logic is learned over time, and you're building out this digital twin, but it's learned partly from users interacting and going about their work, and then partly it's the back end that's trying to harmonize it, and then where it has questions, it's asking builders or business users.
Okay, excellent. Let's use an example, which is really interesting. That you chose this one, George. Alex, bring up the next slide. You use Atlan and their version of Cortex context and sense. George, it's fascinating to me that you chose Atlan, because on one of my lunch breaks from theCUBE, I went over to Atlan, I zeroed in on their booth, and I grabbed a product manager and asked him to walk me through how they add value above and beyond what Snowflake does. I was really interested in this because I know, kind of Atlan's in that space, how you compete with Snowflake, do you compete, how you complement them. And it clearly appeared to me that they had a very rich capability that went beyond what Snowflake can do today. And, we talked about compounded learning and how their system deals with conflicts. And he explained how it sort of forces the surfacing of the agreed upon metric, that single metric of truth, and how their agent learns from exceptions and on and on. It was quite impressive. It was a great demo. He answered all my questions. Others were gathering around and asking other technical questions. A very interesting example within the ecosystem, and one that is evolving. Take us through your thinking here, if you would.
Okay, so the idea here was that we did not have a good visual from Snowflake of how Cortex Sense, which is the ambient intelligence beyond Cortex Horizon, the Horizon context works, which is it's enriching the so far basic level rules. And here, it builds on what we're showing from Atlan is it builds on the metadata ingestion from, as you can see on the left, data warehouses, SaaS applications, operational apps, workflows, on and on. And it starts to bridge these from semantic views into semantic graphs. And this is both Atlan and Snowflake are doing this, but right now Atlan is somewhat further along. And the idea is, if you can take semantic views, which are, narrow in scope in terms of the metrics and dimensions, and then you turn them into graphs, then you're like showing how the metrics relate, how metrics connect to each other, like how customer lifetime value connects to sales, connects to, profits, that sort of connection. But when you connect them, then AI can traverse those relationships, and it can better answer questions about like why. And so what Atlan is showing is the number of sources that they're collecting this ambient intelligence from. And what they're also showing is that every time someone interacts with it, that they are sharpening their view of this basic semantics and ontology and the ambient intelligence on top of it, and integrating things like skills. Now, we put this on here because it shows how they all connect and relate, and why it's a compounding process when users and agents interact with this. And I could not find a slide from Snowflake that showed this. I thought this was more effective. Now, the point here was Atlan has an offering that is, essentially farther along. Now it's a third party, so they have to sell into the Snowflake base, but they're also trying to say we add this richness, beyond the Snowflake engine, where we're crossing other engines too.
Okay. Thank you for that, George. Alex, bring up the next slide, and George, stay on Atlan, if you would, for a moment, because what else can you add here in terms of how the learning interacts with the clients? There's more color that you can go into.
Okay, so here, and again, this is I'm using Atlan, and I'm also describing Snowflake, but the idea is with Sense, you've got this auto ingest beyond the database's analytic tables, but you might say, I want to connect Power BI or DBT and its metric definitions, but then you're also connecting the query history and whatever existing semantic views you have and what's in different catalogs, and you're building context across all these. Again, this is the idea, is that you're trying to eliminate islands by building a richer representation that essentially eliminates islands. And so in Sense starts creating its own context knowledge. It finds perhaps conflicts in the metric definitions, which I think we discussed, like there are 5 definitions of daily active users. And a builder would guide to disambiguate. And then builder might also create and review new knowledge in the layer. Then you would give it to users in CoWork, business users, and they might ask questions that fall outside existing semantic views, or document oriented intelligence that's not already captured here. And then a builder would look at those interactions and say, here's where I need to build out that context foundation some more, whether it's Horizon context or Horizon Sense, or in Atlan's case, their context foundation. But the point is, it's a feedback loop. It's a compounding learning loop. The richer you make that foundation, the richer the interactions with the users, and the better feedback you'll get. And again, part of that feedback is the user memory and user skills, and then what falls out of the queries and semantic views that you've defined already.
So that's a good setup for Snowflake's roadmap, and how much, if at all, how much is trying to co-opt the entire value chain versus its intention to work with partners, to fill gaps. And George, as you well know, in conversations that we've had in the past, many, in fact, with Benoit Dageville, the founder, one of the founders of Snowflake, who, by the way, is stepping down from an operational role this month, mid-June. But nonetheless, Benoit's indication to us was always, we want to leave a lot of room for the ecosystem and the partners. And I tested this on theCUBE this week, and I think that's still the case, obviously. But it's also clear that Snowflake, wants to capture more of that value, and I think understands that it must capture more of that value, or we'll get disintermediated. So Alex, bring up the next slide, please. And we showed a version of this last week, George, but in the upper right, you got the SOI exploding into the middle layers, labeled the data model. And then we're going to build into the maturing of the sophistication of the analytics that are going to lead us to the higher quality actions. But George, start here with the data model and then explain how the context and the sense layers of the SOI mature across the 9 stages that we laid out last week in your detailed model.
Okay, we've sharpened it somewhat from what we've learned this past week. And we're unpacking the bottom three layers of the system of intelligence, which is the rules about how the business does run, and the most basic tacit knowledge about what happens when there are no rules or when they conflict. Because in the age of agents, everything depends on the extent to which the scope and fidelity of your data model reflects how your business operates. And as you were saying, this dictates the sophistication of the analytic questions you can ask, which will be the next slide. And then the analytic sophistication in turn dictates the confidence in the underlying agent actions. So at the very bottom layer, this is the BI reporting cubes, metrics and dimensions. This is what semantic views are. And we'll see Unity metrics the week after next. And the reason we put them here is to show in context how much more sophisticated this can get. The next layer, one customer master record. This is master data management. So that across all your estate, you know all the attributes that relate to one particular customer. Level 3, this is streaming events in real time. So like e-commerce interactions update the recommended products that you're seeing on your intelligent client in a consumer scenario in real time. Layer 4 is going up this stack of the data model. Layer 4 or maturity level 4 is you can categorize customers into things like high-value shoppers, fraudsters in real time. In layer 5, it's a probabilistic prediction about a particular customer. Is this one likely to buy? So how should you treat them in real time? In 6, this is the web of related things, where the model represents what is and how it's connected. So this customer is a node, it's connected to an order, the SKUs in that order, the promotions associated with it, the fulfillment center, the carrier, all that sort of stuff. Layer 7, this is the sale as a set of possible moves. Now you're modeling actions. And this is important because you can set preconditions and postconditions, what can be done at any point. And then in level 8, this is where you're not pointing to other external applications and trying to harmonize them. This is the sale as it's happening right now. This is a live model of the business. This is when you can unplug your operational applications. Layer 9 is now I have such a rich model of the business, I can change how the sale runs because that is now a data update. Now the rules, in other words, the rules about the business are managed as data too. So it's not a code deploy. Analytics can optimize the processes in the business itself.
Okay, thank you, George. Appreciate that. Now, okay, Alex, so as we said, we're going to go through in a sequence here. So Alex, bring up the next slide. And George, walk us through the context and sense and how they support the maturity model of the analytics capabilities, and then how that evolves and becomes more sophisticated over time.
Okay, so I'm gonna group these into categories rather than go through every layer. But again, as context and sense becomes a richer model of how the business operates, then you can ask and answer more sophisticated questions. At levels 1 and 2, this is descriptive. It's what happened. The model can count and aggregate first within a silo, then across departments. So what did Maria buy during the spring promotion? Levels 3 and 4, it's diagnostic. Why did it happen? So like with events preserved in temporal order and behavioral layers, layered in level 3, you can say, why did Maria's tent purchase convert so fast? At level 4, that pattern gets a name. Maria is a deal-driven replenisher. Levels 5 and 6, this is prescriptive. At 5, it's now every entity carries continuously updated predictions. Maria has a 68% probability of repurchasing in this category within 30 days. So, what should we do based on that probability? Level 6 is the relationships are traversable, so it sharpens your understanding of that particular customer. Maria has a 68% probability of repurchasing in this category within 30 days and a 19% churn risk, driven because we delivered the last 2 products to her late. So issuing free shipping offer would lift her retained value by X amount of dollars. That's an example of yet more sophisticated analytics. At layer 7 and 9, now the pure analytic reach gets much richer. The analysis can tell you not just the live state and process, but it can tell you about the business. So level 7 is the business's possibility space. It becomes legible. You can say, for the spring sale across every order currently mid-checkout, which ones are eligible for a split shipment and what's the delivery time effect of each. Level 8, this is when you have a live state of the business as part of your digital twin, and it's not a snapshot. Then you're saying what is actually true right now across everything simultaneously. And so you can say, at this instant, how much tent inventory remains, how many carts hold one, which fulfillment centers are at capacity, and where are carrier delays emerging. Level 9, this is where the operating logic becomes inspectable and optimizable. So the workflow stages, decision rules, coordination patterns, it's all data. So the analysis can answer, how does this business actually run? And is that the best way? So what is the defined path an order takes from cart to settlement? What rules govern each transition? And where do orders actually stall versus where we assumed they would? And so the key thing is, in level 7, the options are knowable. Level 8 makes its present knowable. Level 9, the operating logic is knowable. And so the through line that matches this whole data model arc, 1 and 2, count the sale. 3 and 4, explain it. 5 and 6, prescribe and quantify behavior. And 7 to 9, act on and improve the process.
Okay, thanks. Now, one more level here, Alex. Bring up the next slide, the last slide, which speaks to the action layer and how, as context and sense mature, it not only improves the analytics piece, but how that's important for the agents to act with confidence. George, walk us through that logic.
Okay, so this is what an agent can actually do across these 4 categories of analytic sophistication built on a richer data model. And the through line is the action sophistication is gated by what the data model represents. So each band can only support the kind of doing that its data and analytics makes safe. Now, levels 1 and 2, this is where we're talking about metrics and dimensions. It's hard for agents to take action, but it can report to users on the state of the business through those metrics. That's layers 1 and 2. The output is really a dashboard. Levels 3 and 4, this is segment level recommendations. And this is where you see like Salesforce Data Cloud, because they understand they understand that it's customer data, so they can model it for customer actionability. So you have events in temporal order and you have behavioral labels. The system can surface customers showing Maria's hesitation broken by promotion pattern convert 3 times better when they're sent a discount within 48 hours. That's a genuine recommendation, but it's about a group. It's a heuristic. A human marketer still pulls the trigger. Levels 5 and 6, this is quantified recommendations about individuals, although humans still decide. Now, every entity carries calibrated predictions. So issue Maria free shipping predicted to cut her 19% churn risk to 7%. Levels 7 to 9, agents discover, compose, and execute within governance bounds. This is where action sophistication crosses from recommending to doing, and it does so in 3 steps. Level 7, the actions are modeled. Retain Maria at an acceptable margin and compose a concrete sequence. Resolve her open delivery complaint, issue retention offer. Level 8, this is with live state. The agent executes against current reality. Mid-flow, it observes that the tent has gone out of stock and substitutes rather than firing an offer it can't fulfill. And human oversight here shifts from approving each step to handling exceptions. Level 9, where the process is data, the agent acts on and improves the process itself, observing that resolving complaints before offering promotions retains deal-driven buyers like Maria better. The point is, we are on a profound journey where the ongoing interaction with business users, even consumers and builders, capturing the traces of each other's activity enriches what is going to be a more sophisticated model of the business over time. That sophisticated model of the business enables much richer analytics, and those analytics allow then agents to observe, orient, decide, and act with much greater confidence and much less human oversight. That's the process. That's the prize.
Amazing, George. Okay, great. Thank you so much. And hopefully our audience is getting a clearer picture of how the AI software stack is evolving and emerging. And hopefully we gave you some clarity on the competitive landscape and how that's changing. Of course, this is not the end destination. Not only we have Databricks Data and AI Summit coming up the week after next, we're also going to be reporting on the frontier model players and of course the debate that's going on inside the Cube research right now, with some folks thinking that the model players are in a stronger position than perhaps George feels, specifically with respect to the system of intelligence and them being that back end and the ambitions that they have there. But for now, we'll leave it there. And suffice to say that a few years ago, Snowflake was, in our view anyway, they were kind of boxed into an analytics domain with, a nice business, but one that was exposed, and it was not seen as an innovator in AI. And overnight, it seemed to, went from a software darling to this sort of modern data legacy. But under the direction of CEO Sridhar Ramaswamy, is not only has that perception changed, but the company's innovation engine seems to be humming. And while we think they could maybe put forth a stronger vision that points in the direction that we've laid out today, we think that the company firmly understands that the prize that's awaiting them and what's necessary to not only preserve its existing business, but to expand its opportunity well beyond their position in the pre-ChatGPT era. I want to thank George Gilbert for his excellent insights and sharing his research, and thank you for watching this episode. We'll see you next time on Breaking Analysis.